Good morning. So this sermon this morning is going to be a tad different than perhaps what you're used to. For my last semester at school, I had to do a senior thesis, and what I'm going to present to you is the end portion of my senior thesis. So I studied art, and I studied social work, and a whole bunch of other things, but basically from January pretty much up until May, for about 5 months or so, I was really digging in to what I call the junction of art and suffering. There's a visual pun, I just like it, see, because a junction is like where things meet, and those are roads meeting. I thought it was funny. So my thesis going into this is a little long, but basically it was to answer the question of how does art approach suffering? When I looked out into the world and the things I like to do, I saw that people like to create, and that's really cool. But at the exact same time, there's so much pain and hurt, and it just seemed that there was a problem in between our love to make things and the hurt we're seeing around us. And so I sought to try to come to some sort of agreement between the two. And what I ended up finding was that if we decide to take the initiative and to approach art that handles these difficult subjects, then the way we interact with ourselves, with people, and with God is all influenced in a positive manner. This is my nice thesis in a giant picture. It's kind of confusing, but to make it simpler, we're just going to be looking at we're just going to be looking at this section right here instead of the entire thing. So the first part is in order to get to the good stuff at the end, we have to lay a foundation. And so when we're talking about art and we're thinking about it, we're talking about aesthetics. And aesthetics is the philosophical study of beauty. There's all around the world, we look at different things, and people from all around the world find different things beautiful. So between Italy, between the Pacific Islands, Mexico, Africa, Japan, China, there's all these different ways of what people find beautiful and what they don't. But here in the West, it is what we have traditionally thought to be beautiful has been really defined by this one man named Immanuel Kant. He was this dude who thought about a lot of different things and wrote a lot of them down. But when he talked about beauty, he said that beauty is aesthetic pleasure. All that can sound really heady, but all that really means is that we choose to paint our walls the color purple because it makes us happy. Why is New England the greatest place to go in the fall? Because the leaves change color. And for some reason, when the leaves change color and we look at it, we are just filled with this immense joy and pleasure, and we love to look at it. And that is what this man said beauty was. Beauty was the experience of pleasure we get when we look at something. This completely revolutionized art. And not just art in art galleries, but art in our everyday interactions with it. Suddenly, things that were beautiful meant that they give us pleasure and they give us joy. So, art has a lot of different art movements, and a part of this pleasure and joy, this is about 1830s or so. So people figured, okay, if beauty is what gives us pleasure, then let's just create everything to give us pleasure. You have the Palace of Versailles in France. You have in this time period just immense, ornate and beautiful architecture and works of art, and it became that the ultimate pleasure had absolutely nothing to do with work. So if you had to use it for any sort of way, it wasn't really beautiful. Paintings and things that you looked at and that experience of pleasure was a solely one-on-one basis, and like doing something and being a part of it, it wasn't really beauty if that was the case. So, as most things like politics, for instance, one group says one thing and another group says the exact opposite. The opposite group were the realists, and they said, no. Pictures of people on swings isn't all that there is to life. Sometimes you have to work hard. So they depicted people, I don't know, working, pulling up potatoes. But if you noticed from all of these pictures, just because the subject matter changes, when you look at it, you still get pleasure from it. The greater idea of beauty that these people were going off of didn't really change. Beauty was still pleasure no matter what you were looking at. But then you get to the 20th century and all of that changes because of World War I and World War II. Suddenly, the world and what everybody thought of the world and beauty doesn't make sense anymore. When you think of beauty as pleasure and say, that is how you represent it in life, and then you see people dying all around you, it doesn't make sense anymore. And artists were taken aback by the fact that people could go through such atrocities and that such suffering could exist. And because of that, they completely rejected the idea of beauty because it was no longer relevant. Where is pleasure relevant when people are in pain? Where is beauty relevant when there's so much to be fixed? And so, artists instead did the exact opposite. And they said that beauty doesn't belong in this world anymore. So we're going to create things, declare it as art, and it's not going to be beautiful. It's really hard for us today to even talk about like modern art and stuff like that because it just feels so distant from the life we live. But if you're in the middle of a war and you're looking around and suffering is right next to you, if we were in Iraq and saw all these people hurting, would it make sense to paint a picture of a flower anymore? Not really. How do you handle something that's supposed to be pleasurable when everything around you isn't? The question from the Western idea of beauty is, how can it exist in a world of suffering? And for me, I related that question directly to what I think about God. Because when we talk about God, God is the good, the true, and the beautiful. But if beauty is no longer relevant in our society, then what do you do about God? Does that mean God is no longer relevant? Does that mean that our thoughts and interactions with God are no longer relevant? I don't believe that. Christians around the world don't believe that. This same tension that you feel in between the beauty and the suffering question is the same tension that exists within the problem of evil. So the problem of evil is this theological thing that isn't far off from what we say when we are hurting. We believe God to be all good. We believe God to be all powerful. We believe God to be all knowing. But when a loved one gets cancer or somebody dies and you look around and you can't understand why a good God, why a powerful God, why an all-knowing God lets this happen to your life. And that tension, that desire to know why these things that are supposed to make sense together don't seem to, is theodicy and is the problem of evil. And While some points of the problem of evil go to the extent and say that God doesn't exist, that's not where we come from as Christians. As Christians, and as a Christian, I believe that God exists. And so when I see suffering in the world, my question isn't, God, are you here? It's, Lord, who are you? If all of these things are happening, are you the God that I've been proclaiming you to be? Because it's hard to see it when nothing around me is making sense anymore. The theodicy question of how can a good and powerful and all-knowing and perfect God exist in a context that is just so surrounded by pain is parallel to the question that the West and beauty and pleasure is asking as well. And so I thought that maybe if we could try to answer one of the questions, we would have a better way to answer the other one. So looking at the Western aesthetic and looking at how the West defines beauty, something seems to be missing. Because when you live out your own life, beauty doesn't seem to be able to last in a world that's in so much trouble and in so much pain. I decided that since so many other cultures have all these other ideas of beauty, maybe if we go to one of them, we can see what their culture has to say about it. So I went to the opposite side of the world, the East, and looked at Japan, because I figured the culture between, say, America and Japan are very, very different, then maybe our ideas of beauty are also different. And I found this quote, that beauty in a narrow sense has no unpleasant element, which caught me off guard completely, because everything I had been learning about beauty up until this point, all it was pleasure. That was the goal, that was the entire thing. But this here said that if that's all that beauty is, it's too narrow a view. In Japan, there is different foundations for what makes up beauty. There are these Japanese words, sabi, yuen, aware, and they mean things such as solitary and desolate, hidden, sorrow. None of these things would I, in my first reaction, place in beauty. Is beauty desolate? That doesn't seem to make sense, because desolate is some word that you use for someone who's like outcast. How can that be beauty? But in Japan, beauty speaks in pain as much as it does in pleasure. It doesn't leave when tragedy strikes. It doesn't become orphaned with war. It's sometimes shown best when sorrow comes into the background. Through every movement and every moment that makes up human existence, beauty remains relevant. There's no need to cast it aside, because it can encompass not just the pleasures and the goodness of human experience, but also the pain. When we're talking about art, from what I've learned after 4 years of study, is that number one, it rarely gives any straight answers. And number two, it requires you to go through a process. It seemed that I had found the answer of, okay, maybe a Japanese understanding of beauty can complete my Western understanding. That maybe there's more to beauty than just pleasure. But if I'm using that to answer my question about God, where does that leave me? How am I supposed to think about God differently? But because we're talking about art, rather than just think about it and go through all these things you can't see going on in my mind, I decided to do art. That's what I do. That's how I process. That's what it requires of me, is to get into the material. And so I decided if Japanese art and Japanese aesthetic was saying these things, then maybe I should try it and then see what I get out of it. So I did. I went through and did this process called kintsugi, which is basically a Japanese way of repairing pottery. So first I had to make a bowl. It was convenient because I was in a ceramics class. And to give you a visual of what it means to create a bowl and throw it on the wheel, I have a 13-second highlight video of it. It takes a lot longer than this. But the concept remains the same. You have a lump of clay. It's nothing at this point. You have to push it and pull it and mold it and make it, and then it goes up. And at some point in time, it could be a vase, or it could maybe be a pitcher, but it isn't. You end up making all these decisions, and sometimes you have to cut things away until it finally becomes that bowl you envisioned it to be. So I made the bowl, I glazed the bowl. I really liked it because it had to have a certain requirement, and I wasn't very good at it. So when I was finally done, I was really proud of it. But for kintsugi, it needs to be broken. So I smashed it with a hammer. It took me a little bit. So suddenly I had not one bowl, but 3 pieces of a bowl. The process of kintsugi involves taking these 3 pieces and putting them back together again. It actually uses this material called urashuri, which basically the stuff in poison ivy that makes you itch. Urashuri is that in its purest form. If you touch it with your skin, it gives you a horrible rash. I figured out I'm not allergic to it, thank goodness, but use gloves, please, if you ever want to try it. The thing about urashuri is that it is an organic substance, which means in step 1, you put the urashuri on the bowl and it has to dry for about 7 days. As it dries, because it's an organic substance, it actually, the parts where it is and the cracks that where you place it in, it becomes stronger because its very presence of being there. After 2 or 3 coats of it in the cracks, every place that was now at its weakest, every place that was now broken is stronger than it was before it was even broken. After that, you go to the next step, which is the 3rd picture, and you put on another layer, it's red. And then while it's still dry, you take gold dust and you pour it all over the pot. You wipe it all away, and when it dries, the bowl is functional again. You can wash it, you can eat out of it, you can use it. No dust is gonna get anywhere. It is stronger than it was. And some would claim it is more beautiful than before it was smashed and before it was broken. For me, kintsugi became a giant metaphor. It became a giant metaphor that helped me understand God differently. Because while I was making the pot, I couldn't help but think of Jeremiah 18 when God asked Jeremiah to go to the potter's house and to watch a man make a pot. I was sitting there and I was making it and I was thinking, Lord, you are that potter. And in the exact same way that you were that potter for Israel, you are that potter for me. I am this clay. And sometimes that's not always the most pleasant thought in the world. that whatever way the potter moves, I move too. And if something has to be cut back, it might hurt some, but it's necessary to get to the end and to get to the vision of what God has planned. But what's mind-boggling is, as hard as it was to break that bowl with a hammer, and as much as I really loved it, I would never become a pot or become a bowl. I like being human, the freedoms that it gives me, the fact that I can think and move and do what I want, where I want. And suddenly it occurred to me that when we're talking about Jesus Christ, if God is the potter and we are the clay, the incarnation is when God stepped back and decided to become a pot too. To step back, to humble himself and step down from his position into the reality of our lives. And not only did God become a pot, metaphorically speaking, but he was smashed as well. In a world where there's so much pain and no clear answers, it can feel really, really hopeless a lot of the time. But as distant as God can feel sometimes, and as much as it doesn't make sense and it's hard to put together, God cared enough about the state of his creation that he sought to repair them. Jesus Christ, in his resurrection and in his ultimate glory, never would have gotten there without being broken. And when we look at our own suffering and when we look at our own pain, maybe the definition of beauty and our own definition of it and what we expect of God for it needs to be expanded. Because it would seem to me that Jesus submitted to suffering in order to be glorified. And when in Philippians, Paul talks about rejoicing, he is not rejoicing because he made it out of suffering. He's in the middle of loss. He is where Job was, everything gone, nothing seemingly to hope for. And yet, in submitting to that and to what God has in store for that, he claims, rejoice. For me, looking at Kintsugi makes me wonder that maybe I have to submit too. That maybe I have to come under being broken. Because it isn't until the pot is broken and in 3 different shards that it can be repaired and it can be stronger and it can be more beautiful than it ever was before. It's the only way to get there. There is no way around it. It's not something to avoid. Suffering is not something to ignore. And it's not when you overcome it that it becomes something important. It is being there. It is submitting to it. It is realizing that God is not looking at your state and walking away, but has given himself in the exact same manner before you, that you find hope there. My friend Moses, when we were talking about this, said something, and he said that we have often begged God for an answer for evil, and I will submit that we have begged God for an answer for suffering. But instead of an answer, instead of the direct intellectual answer of why the things in our lives happen, he has given us himself. And it is through giving us himself that we might not completely understand suffering, but we are able to live in it, and we are able to rejoice always. Thank you.